We're not calling for a separation of morality and state. We are not calling for a separation of righteousness and state. We're not calling for a separation of God and state. We are simply saying two different human governments, both answerable to Christ, are to be distinct. You're not to confuse church government and civil government. Well, that distinction of governments is a Christian theological development. And one of the places in history where that was developed, one of the places in history that helped establish this was this episode I'm about to tell you about. It's one of the more important episodes in the history of Western civilization. It's certainly one of the most important episodes in church history. And it was the showdown between Ambrose of Milan in Italy and the Emperor Theodosius. The Emperor Theodosius reigned from 379 to 395 AD. Just aside, Ambrose of Milan was the preacher, a very influential preacher who was responsible for leading, as far as human instruments go, was responsible for leading Augustine to the Lord. So Augustine was being taught and instructed by Ambrose of Milan when he was converted. And also, a little side note, Augustine was once astonished when he came upon Ambrose, who had apparently developed or was one of the early pioneers in reading silently to yourself. In the old days, when you were reading a book in a room by yourself, in the old days, you would read aloud to yourself because that's what reading was. You would just read aloud because that's reading, right? And Augustine came upon Ambrose, who was sitting there reading a book, making no noise, whatever. And Augustine's response was along the lines of, "Whoa, that's weird." So Ambrose was quite an influential figure. Now what happened was Theodosius, this is post-Constantine, this is after Constantine, and Theodosius was a professing Christian and apparently sincere enough as that went. But he was the emperor and he also had a temper. He was the emperor and he had a temper. And one time there was an uprising in Thessalonica where a few of his officials were killed. So there was a riot or unrest of some sort in Thessalonica, and a few of his officials were killed. The emperor lost his temper, and he responded to it by inviting the citizens of the city into the theater as though he were going to show them a play, and then he sent in his soldiers. And his soldiers killed about 7,000 Thessalonians. So there was a slaughter because the emperor lost his temper because the Thessalonians had killed a couple of his officials. And the soldiers didn't distinguish between guilt or innocence. They just went in and killed 7,000 people. Now, after this, Theodosius, remember, is a professing Christian. Theodosius came to Milan, where Ambrose was, and he was going to go to church and partake of the Lord's Supper. He was met by Ambrose in the sight of everyone who prohibited him and excommunicated the emperor. Now, this is not just David who had killed one man to cover up the crime. This is Theodosius, who's just killed 7,000 people because he lost his temper. Okay? And so Ambrose met him and excommunicated him and required him to do penance for his awful crime. Theodosius remarkably accepted this, and his status as an excommunicant lasted for about 8 months, after which the emperor was required to come to the church with the other penitents, prostrate himself on the ground, and publicly confess his sin to the congregation. The emperor, the most powerful man in the world, was required by Ambrose, who had no guns, who had no arms, had nothing but spiritual authority. He publicly confessed his sin, and the whole thing resulted in important legal reforms that would prevent that sort of thing from happening again. It wasn't just say you're sorry and we'll forget about it. It was Ambrose was playing hardball, and it was the government of the church and the government of the state. And it's not that there's no traffic between them. They each have something to say to each other, and Ambrose said what needed to be said. So Ambrose, again, speaks truth to power.